So there's been a question of late as the series of protests, some turned into riots, seems to be sweeping across the United States from coast to coast. And those questions all seem to revolve around violence. Why is it necessary to be violent? What purpose does it serve? Why do people choose this route? Why aren't people going the route of Dr. King and deliberately being nonviolent? Well, those are all good questions, but all of those are tied up in what is the definition of violence and how does it apply to this situation. So let's look at a couple definitions of violence. So the first is behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Okay? Another way of saying that could be brutality. Another way of saying that could be savagery. But I have one question with regard to this definition. We say it's behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill. Could violence also be non-physical forces? Could they be psychological, emotional, verbal, cognitive, spiritual? Could they be things that attack you in other than a physical means with the intention to hurt, damage, or kill? Question to ask yourself. The next definition is the strength of emotion or an unpleasant or destructive natural force. Now, another way to look at that might be severity or vehemence. And the only question I have with this definition is it calls out an unpleasant or destructive natural force. So my question to that would be, could violence erupt from unnatural forces? So rather than being a hurricane, a landslide, an earthquake, or something of that nature, could violence also come from unnatural, man-made means? Is this something that can be done by people? Good question to ask yourself. The last definition we're going to look at is the unlawful exercise of physical force or intimidation by the exhibition of such force. And that can more commonly be thought of as bullying, or in its very extreme force, as terrorism. So I've got a couple issues with this one. The first is that it specifies the unlawful exercise. The unlawful exercise. Okay, so that seems to say that the law enforcers, the state, cannot be guilty of violence in using physical force to intimidate or to hurt, kill, or damage. But we've seen that before. That's what a revolution is. That's what social movements are. They are the use of force or intimidation by exhibiting force in order to protest and change unjust laws. So is violence really only the purview of someone acting against the state? Or can violence also be perpetrated by the state? The other is, again, it's looking at physical force. So it's still saying that violence is only a physical thing. Whereas I think most people would understand that it's entirely possible to be violent towards someone in a psychological way, in an emotional way, in a spiritual way, in a cognitive way, in a verbal way, in a way that discredits or damages their identity, their culture, their nationality, their sexual preference, their lifestyle. So I think we need to expand what we call violence when we ask the question, what purpose does violence serve and is violence necessary? But okay, so if we look at those three definitions and we add in those caveats that we added about, is it only natural? Is it only physical? Is it only unlawful? Consider that for what it is. But the question then becomes, okay, so let's just take the definitions as they are. If violence is only around natural forces, that are exhibited physically in an unlawful exercise, then could it be said that violence by way of the American Revolution or violence by way of the Civil War, were these violent acts? Were these things that were unnecessary? Were these things that were unwarranted and didn't have purpose? I don't think so. I don't think so. Even back when the Declaration of Independence was being read, there was a line in there about the tree of liberty needs to be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So often people forget those last two words, with the blood of patriots, and that's usually where they end the quote. But they forget the last piece about and tyrants. And that's really where I want to kind of start this conversation of tyrants, tyranny. What is it in that quote? What is it in our present reality that is this American dictate, this part of our founding identity that we would declare an enemy or something we need to be independent from? Tyranny. Now, how can tyranny be described? How is tyranny captured? Back in the American Revolution, it was, are we represented in our legislature? Are we represented in the decisions that are made on our person? Are we represented in the decisions that are made about us that we have to abide by and live with? And in those cases, they were not. And they were violently, again, using this word violently, even though it was legal at the time, according to the British Crown, for the British soldiers to keep the American colonists in line with whatever the British law decided was okay for them. But this violence that was subjected at the tyrannical British government that did not recognize the rights and the sovereignty and the ability of the American colonists to govern themselves or to be treated fairly as any other subject of the British monarchy was due, was not acceptable. It was not acceptable. And so we went to war. We had a flat out revolution against our lawful government at the time, because we wanted to be represented, we wanted to be heard, we wanted to be recognized as sovereign, we wanted to be able to govern ourselves and to be treated fairly by a government that included us rather than a government that dismissed us. Okay? So if that's okay for how the country was founded, if that's okay for how the country was created, then please explain to me how it's different now. Because I realize there are some people that just don't see how our current government, and when I say current government, I mean long before this current administration. This has been happening since our country's inception and before that, when we were still British colonies. That there are populations of American citizens, now American citizens, that have not been represented, treated fairly, protected in the way that other Americans are, or given the same opportunity to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as others. And living in that circumstance, even as things have gotten better generation after generation, living in that circumstance is to be under the thumb of a tyrannical government. A government that says it's okay for us to incarcerate you over petty crimes. It's okay for us to brutalize you over police stops when you've committed no crime. It's okay for us to kill you if we decide that we are in danger when there's actually no danger being faced. and that the exercise of those abuses, the exercise by the government, by agencies of the government, should go unpunished, as they have been, not just for the last month or the last year or the last 10 years, but for literally hundreds of years in this country. That the state should be able to abuse and use its power, and let's go back to our definitions, involving the physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill, and do so with impunity. Which kind of brings me back to that third definition of, is violence reserved only for those who are not a part of the state? And if so, I think we've got a broken definition of violence, because I think we can very clearly see, for those that know this country's history, that violence has been a very real part of this state and this country throughout its entire history. And on top of that, that violence doesn't always just come in physical forms. It comes in economic forms. Where no, you don't get to get that loan. We're not going to let you buy that house. We're not going to let you into this school. It comes in political forms. No, we're not going to recognize your vote. No, we're not going to prop up your candidate. No, we're not going to allow you to use your constitutionally given right to exercise your voice in creating and shaping the government of this country and of its states. It can be done in emotional and psychological ways, where we say, no, you are too ghetto for this. No, you are too ethnic for this. Oh, no, not with your accent. No, not with your hair like that. No, not with your faith. In a land that has freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. In a land that supposedly recognizes anyone who was born here as an American citizen the same as any other. So I ask the question, especially around that third definition, is the unlawful exercise of force or intimidation the only definition of violence? Because it could be said that violence already pre-existed the current protests and the riots. Violence pre-existed the current Black Lives Matter movement. Violence pre-existed Colin Kaepernick's Take a Knee and all of the other factors that are currently in play in this discussion about police brutality and police accountability. Because violence is the very thing that they were protesting against. Violence is the exact reason for the movement. Because we are trying to stop the violence. We are trying to stop the violence. Many people say that they want to go back to before these protests and before these riots and before all of this outrage, and go back to when there was peace. And what many of them don't realize is that there never was a time for many of us where there was peace. Not ever. Not ever. Not in this country. Not ever. Peace is something that we're trying to get to. It's not something we're trying to return to. Because we never had it. We were subject to state violence the entire time we've been here. And so this concept of going back to the peace that some of us have known is not acceptable, because it's not peace for us. And it never was. So let's look at the definition of one other word, because this is the one that is probably most accurate to what's going on right now, and it's the one that's least discussed. And that word is self-defense. Self-defense. It's something that we pride ourselves in. It's something that we created the world's largest and most powerful fighting force in the world for the purpose of defending ourselves and our interests. So let's look at the definition of self-defense. Self-defense is the defense of one's person or interest, especially through the use of physical force, which is permitted in certain cases as an answer to a charge of violent crime. So there's a lot in that definition. But let's start with the beginning. So the defense of one's person or interest. So in a world where police, judges, politicians, lawyers, prosecutors are able legally, according to the current laws of the land, legally able to physically abuse my person with or without cause beyond what they are legally able to do to other citizens, then my person and the persons that I care about, my children, my family, my friends, my community, need defense. Second is especially through the use of physical force. So self-defense can be physical in nature. So if someone attacks you, if someone initiates the use of force against you, in the act of self-defense, you can use the act of physical force against your attacker. I believe some people call it fighting fire with fire. And in some cases, that's the only way you can do it. But there is also the option of fighting fire with water, which is much more effective, which is what we started out doing. Many of you probably won't remember going all the way back, going back to Trayvon Martin's murder 7 years ago, where the Black Lives Matter movement started, that those protests were peaceful, that those protests were nonviolent, that those protests were a way to use water to fight fire. Because it was not our goal, then or now, to tear the whole system down in order to get our way. It was simply our goal to be heard. And when being heard, to be at the table that makes the new laws of the land, such that the abuses of the past and present were no longer legal, were no longer sanctioned by the government, federal, state, or local. That it would be illegal to continue the abuses of the past on communities of color with impunity. And so those protests continued for 7 years. And they weren't heard. They were ignored. They were vilified. When Colin Kaepernick invited professional football athletes and athletes around the globe to take a knee in protest against the abuses of the state on communities of color, it was vilified. Even though he did it in a manner that agreed with soldiers who protect this nation, because it was never about protesting soldiers. It was never about protesting a country. It was about protesting the legal practices of that land and changing them. And he was vilified along with many of the other athletes that were vilified. And after so long of seeing our fight fire with water, or our nonviolent approach shoved to the side, vilified, those leaders martyred, completely taken out of the picture. When that happens for long enough and the abuses keep piling up with visual evidence and nothing changes, well, at that point, we can't do the fight fire with water, because fighting fire with water isn't working. If it's a grease fire, using water is not going to work. So then at that point, something else has to happen. And we have to go into self-defense mode. And if that self-defense has to be violent, so be it. Because in the world we live in, violence is already being visited on us in a far too frequent occasion. So we use self-defense in defense of our person, in defense of those we love, in defense of our communities, and in defense of our interests. So that when the state continues its abuses, that there be repercussion to that, so that hopefully we can redress it and eliminate these abuses in the future. So to the question of, is violence necessary? I'll say this. Violence was never necessary. It was never necessary. It wasn't necessary to be a part of the abuses that sparked this, which is what we originally tried to redress. And it wasn't necessary to be part of the protest if our concerns were heard, if our concerns were addressed, if the abuses stopped, and if the law changed its stance on state-sanctioned terrorism, abuse and terrorism of communities of color around the country. There are a lot of ways violence could have been prevented and should have been prevented. But to say now that those communities, those individuals who have been subject to state-sanctioned violence for centuries, to say to them now that violence is unnecessary, what purpose does it serve? It serves the very same purpose that our government created our military: to defend us. And that is a right that all Americans have. Thank you for your time.